Welcome everyone to this special online seminar on history and institutional memory, official, authorized and internal histories in perspective. My name is Philip Murphy. I'm Director of History and Policy, and History and Policy is a network of historians hosted at the IHR, dedicated to showing how historical insights and expertise can aid the policy-making process. And of course, historically, so way back, at least as far as the establishment of the Cabinet Office's Official Histories Programme in 1908, official and internal histories commissioned by government have been an important part of that learning process. But they've also been, I suppose, a controversial art form within the historical profession. And that's something that we want to explore today. Really inspired by a book that the IHR has just published with the University of London Press by Patrick Salmon, called The Control of the Past, Herbert Butterfield and the Pitfalls of Official History. And that is available online in an open access publication free of charge. We'll put the details up on the chat in a minute. So it's absolutely free to download, and I really recommend that you read it because it's a tremendously rich and thought-provoking book. Patrick, I'm delighted to say, is going to be the first of our panelists. And Patrick, as most of you will know, is Chief Historian at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. A prolific author, a very respected scholar of diplomatic history, with particular reference in his earlier career to Scandinavia and to the Baltic states. And we're delighted to have Patrick with us. Alongside him on the panel, we have Helen McCarthy, who is Professor of Modern and Contemporary British History at the University of Cambridge, where she's been since 2018. And for the purposes of our seminar today, we're flagging up her work, Women of the World, The Rise of the Female Diplomat, published by Bloomsbury in 2014. She knows the history of the Foreign Office very, very well indeed, and more recently has published Double Lives, A History of Working Motherhood, again by Bloomsbury in 2020, which was shortlisted for the Wolfson Prize for History. We're delighted to have someone who is directly involved in policy making and very much at the sharp end of policy making as we speak, Rachel King. Who has worked with history and policy in the past to talk about how Whitehall uses and consumes history. Rachel joined the Civil Service in 2008. Her first job was at the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. She moved to the Prime Minister's Private Office, number 10, and then to the Treasury. And she's currently Deputy Principal Private Secretary to the Foreign Secretary. Thank you so much for joining us, Rachel. The fourth member of the panel is Professor Simon J. Ball, Professor of International History and Politics at the University of Leeds. And again, for our purposes, the thing that we're flagging up, and I think it's a wonderful book, is Simon's Secret History, Writing the Rise of Britain's Intelligence Services, which is a really fascinating account of how the intelligence community and Whitehall tried to capture that history in the first half of the 20th century. And that was published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2020. Simon's a prolific author. His other books including The Bitter Sea, The Struggle for the Mastery in the Mediterranean, and one of my favorite books, The Guardsman, Harold Macmillan, Three Friends and the World They Made, about the impact of the First World War on that generation. And finally, but very delighted to have Michael Goodman, who is Professor of Intelligence and International Affairs head of the Department of War Studies and Dean of Research Impact at King's College London. Again, for the purposes of this seminar, it's important to say that Mike is the author of Volume 1 of the Official History of the Joint Intelligence Committee, which covers the period from the Second World War to the Suez Crisis. But again, a prolific author of works on the intelligence community, including Spying on the Nuclear Bear, which volumes may be being dusted off even as we speak. Spinning Intelligence, Why Intelligence Needs the Media, Why the Media Needs Intelligence, and Learning from the Secret Past. So we couldn't be more profoundly blessed by the richness of the expertise on our panel. I'm going to ask each of the panelists really just to introduce themselves and their approach to the subject for about 5 minutes. We're going to have a discussion between the panelists for 20-25 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the floor. So please, as thoughts occur to you, do write down your questions in the chat. Don't have to wait until the end, and my colleague Jacob Forward will feed those questions into the discussion in the final half hour or so. We will be recording this session, and we will make it available on our website, all being well. So without further ado, let me thank all our panelists again and introduce Patrick to speak first.
Thanks, Philip, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here and to be among so many old friends I see, not only among the panelists, but also among the audience. It's great to see old colleagues and so on. Just to explain my starting point, I've been at the Foreign Office now, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, since 2003 and Chief Historian since 2005. But before that, I spent about 22 years at Newcastle University, and I can see a couple of former colleagues here already. So in a sense, almost half my career now has been spent as an official historian, and more than half as a normal historian. And in a sense, therefore, I'm a poacher turned gamekeeper, and I think I am in a good position to see both sides and to try to balance them as best I can. The book, I'll talk a bit about the book, I think, and then use that as the jumping off point for maybe further discussion. The book I wrote was based on Herbert Butterfield's article in 1949, republished in 1951, called Official History, Its Criteria and Its Pitfalls. And it's been described as the most violent attack on official history of any British historian since the Second World War. And what I've tried to do is work out why he came to write it, and then what he thought about official history, and then what that might mean for us. So the first part is really how he came to write it, and that in a way is a detective story, which I find entertaining. I'm not sure anybody else will, but it is quite intriguing, the way in which he was alerted to a problem identified actually by a young Irish colleague of his, Desmond Williams, who was working on the editing of the German diplomatic documents which had been captured by the Allies, working on them first in Berlin and then near Bletchley Park. And Desmond Williams came to the conclusion that the British government was trying to conceal or even destroy certain documents. He alerted Butterfield to this, and Butterfield started his campaign to criticize and alert colleagues to the pitfalls of official history. What the documents were is unclear, but my conclusion is that they're almost certainly something to do with the Duke of Windsor. I think a lot of us know that story. It's even appeared on Netflix in The Crown. But of course, this is one of the more embarrassing episodes when the Duke of Windsor was deemed to have been dealing with Nazi officials in Spain and Portugal on his way out from occupied France to the West Indies in 1940, after the fall of France. So that's the sort of story, I think, which was behind it. But what's in a way more interesting from our point of view is what he thought about official history. And if you don't mind, I'll come back to that in a minute, because the latter part of my book is also, I think, quite relevant, and that is really what happened to official history in the 70 years or so since Butterfield wrote his article. And along large chunk of my book is taken up with tracing the history of official history since the Second World War along a number of strands. One strand is the Cabinet Office strand, if you like, the official history of the Second World War and its two major series, military and civil. And then the peacetime series, which was launched in 1966 by Harold Wilson, and to which, among other people, Michael Goodman has been a contributor. And then there's another set of strands, which is the publication of diplomatic documents. And this started in the late 1940s. This was a thing that Butterfield was getting agitated about. The series Documents on British Foreign Policy, 1939, which most of us know, those huge black volumes sitting in libraries, which some of us sometimes read, but still a key source really for the diplomatic history of the interwar period. Then there was the parallel series of German diplomatic documents, which Desmond Williams was helping to edit, which was also coming out from the late 1940s. And then there's the successor to Documents on British Foreign Policy, which is what we do, Documents on British Policy Overseas, the series edited by the Foreign Office historians and covering British foreign policy since 1945 through the Cold War in particular. And right at the end of the book, I reflect on where official history might go from here. And again, I think we might come back to that. In many ways, I think it's run into the sand, but there may be hope for the future. Well, what I want to do now is really end my sort of preliminary remarks by just saying what Butterfield thought about official history and then seeing where this takes us. There's a couple of famous quotations from that article. One of them, it reads as follows: "I do not personally believe that there is a government in Europe which wants the public to know all the truth." The point about Butterfield is that he was deeply suspicious of all governments and had been so since very early in his career. In the 1920s and 30s, he was a pupil of Harold Temperley, one of the editors of the British diplomatic documents on the origins of the First World War. So in a way, he knew what he was talking about. And his second aphorism, if you like, is another quotation: "It may be necessary that official history should be produced. It is equally necessary that it should be submitted to unremitting scrutiny." I think the important point here is that he wasn't hostile to all official history. He just wanted to make sure it was done properly. What was wrong with official history in Butterfield's view? Two things. One is that official historians, and unofficial historians for that matter, can never be sure they've seen all the relevant documents for the subject they are studying. Butterfield believed that the really important ones were the ones that are hidden away and government didn't want you to see. And he used the metaphor of the secret drawer. There's always a secret drawer right at the end, and they've got the key and they don't want you to find it. Now, this is a sort of the paranoid view of history, if you like. The question is whether it's true. And we might come back to that point again. Governments are in the business of concealing things. We know they are. On the other hand, I have to say that my experience of government is more cock-up than conspiracy, if you like, that usually when things are hidden, they've been forgotten about rather than deliberately concealed. But of course, there are exceptions. And the problem is we don't know when the exceptions happen. So that's the first point, the secret drawer. And I think we might come back to that one. The second one is, if you're a reader of official history, if you're reading those massive volumes, you can't necessarily trust it because you can't check the sources. Especially if you look at the volumes produced in the history of the Second World War, there's no footnotes. There were editions with footnotes, but they were confined to officialdom. Officials could see them, but the unfootnoted versions were the ones that everybody else had to see. And the essence of history, of course, is that it's a science in the sense that you can check your sources, you can repeat the experiment, just like physical scientists can. So if you can't check all the sources, you have to take on trust what the official historian has told you. Is that adequate? I think we might come back to the point again, because I think we, as historians, feel we're honest in what we do, but there is necessarily some form of compromise, I'm sure, right the way through our activity. And the point, I think, is, it's this balance between trying to tell a story as best you can, and yet not being able to provide all the backup evidence for that story. There's those 2 points, and I'll just repeat them again. You don't know you've seen all the sources if you're working through them. There may be a secret drawer, and you can't check the sources if you're actually reading what the official historian has told you. I think, Philip, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and you've given us a lot of points that we can come back to, I think. Helen, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's really lovely to be on this panel. I am not an official historian, but I am very interested in histories of government policy making and the civil service, and these themes have woven through much of my work, but perhaps in a most concentrated fashion, as Philip suggested, in the project which I carried out on the history of women in British diplomatic life, which was published as a book called Women of the World, The Rise of the Female Diplomat in 2014. I carried out this project independently as an academic historian, but very much in conversation with the FCDO historians, and Patrick was extremely helpful and friendly from the beginning, which was wonderful for me. But I thought it might be useful, just for the purposes of this panel, to kind of consider as a kind of thought experiment how that project might have looked a bit different had it been conducted as an official history. And I think the first point to make is that actually the FCDO historians had already produced their own research notes on women in the Foreign Office, fairly short and brief and concise, but an extremely kind of useful piece of research, certainly for me, coming at the topic. And I think also it was very useful for me to have contacted Patrick at the beginning and told him what I was up to, and then have a kind of endorsement stroke blessing from the FCDO historians, which I could then refer to when I was getting in touch with my interview participants, because at the heart of the book lies about 25 oral history interviews that I carried out with mostly retired diplomats. And I think some of them probably wouldn't have spoken to me had I not had a kind of, general endorsement from the FCDO historians. I think, had it been an official history, I probably would have had greater access. I don't know whether there is a secret drawer in relation to the history of women in the Foreign Office. There probably is. There may be several secret drawers. So I was mostly limited to the material that I could find at the National Archives in terms of official sources. And it might have been that as an official historian, I could have dug around and got hold of more. And I think another consideration is that, one of the things I was interested in doing was sort of producing research that might be of interest and of use to people inside the Foreign Office who were interested in issues of gender equality, workplace equality, diversity, inclusion, flexibility, work-life balance, all of those kinds of issues. And although I was able, when the book came out, to give a few talks to various staff networks, and quite a lot of sort of female diplomats, I think, read the book because, out of kind of interest in the subject. But I don't think I had the kind of sort of sustained or kind of close relationships with people inside the Foreign Office, which might have facilitated more kind of policy input, or more kind of input into the policy making process around things like, as I say, gender, diversity. And it's interesting because after this project, I then worked again with Patrick on an AHRC funded collaborative doctoral studentship partnership, which involved having 2 PhD students spending part of their time based with the FCDO historians team, and they were both doing projects that were broadly on the histories of diversity, employment, and gender at the FCDO. One of whom, James Southern, has published his PhD, and he was looking particularly at histories of recruitment and diversity. And I got the sense from him, I've talked to him, that he was much more able to kind of make himself visible to people inside the FCDO and kind of tell them that this is what he was doing, and having more of a sense of how he could sort of tailor his research in ways that might actually be kind of useful and legible for people inside the FCO. So I feel that was something which perhaps I wasn't able to do so well from my position outside. I mean, I think there also were advantages from doing this project as an academic historian rather than an official one. So I had no particular remit in terms of the period I was covering, in terms of the people I was talking to, in terms of the sorts of lateral connections that I might want to make between the history of women in the FCO and the history of women in other kinds of organizations or other domains of professional life. You know, I could really sort of think about all sorts of contexts coming from perhaps my sort of academic engagement with wider literatures, which might perhaps have been harder if I was sort of working to a narrower and more prescriptive institutional remit. I think with my interviews, actually, there were advantages to sort of at least projecting myself as kind of the ignorant outsider to whom things needed to be explained very carefully. And perhaps you know, the sense that I wasn't here kind of on a kind of government or sort of official business. And then I guess, you know, I didn't have to kind of go soft or be careful in terms of what I said about the FCO's record on gender diversity. I think there can be a tendency for institutions to kind of weave a narrative around, you know, oh, things were really bad in the past, but we're so much better now. And, you know, we've learnt our lessons, and that's maybe a kind of standard narrative that you often get. And I, you know, perhaps I might have felt more obliged to develop that kind of narrative in my work. And then finally, and this is my final point, you know, as I said, this book was written kind of as a sort of crossover trade history. And I very much wanted to write a kind of lively and accessible book that could be read by a general readership. And that, you know, could be sort of quite widely reviewed, and I could go and give talks about it to audiences beyond academia and also beyond the Foreign Office. And I think that it might again have been harder perhaps to do that if I was working under the auspices of official history and having to, as I say, sort of kind of tailor what I was doing much more towards a policy audience. But in a way, you know, it comes down to what is it that you're trying to do as a historian? You know, what research questions excite you and interest you, and who is the audience for your research? So I'll leave it there, but I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Helen. Again, some really, really important points that I'm sure we'll come back to. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you, Philip. And again, thank you from me for the invitation to join this discussion. I thought I would start just by saying a few words about my personal involvement with history and official and perhaps less official histories of Whitehall, and also the role of history in policy making, and then offer a few observations. I first got interested in this actually when I was working in the Prime Minister's office. And I set up a project which is still running, working with history and policy, also with the Strand Group at King's College London, about the history of 10 Downing Street, the history of the institution of Prime Minister. And that involved articles from guest historians about different aspects of the history of the building, the role of Prime Minister, the wider institution, and so on, as well as biographies of previous Prime Ministers. And that project then evolved and developed an oral history strand where histories have been collected from staff members in the Prime Minister's office, as well as from former cabinet secretaries. So this is not really an official history as such, but I think is quite an interesting tangent to the official history. My career then took me to the Treasury, and I took my interest with me, but moved in a slightly different direction and focused more on the role of history in policy making, which is an area that I think is extremely rich. And that led to a number of different projects, but just to give one example, around in the aftermath of the financial crisis, I worked with groups of policymakers in the Treasury and with historians to look at previous examples of fiscal and financial crisis and what those could contribute to contemporary policymaking in the Treasury. So that's really a sort of second use of history as perhaps history as comparative evidence. A third encounter, which is one which is rather horribly relevant today, this week, of all weeks, is more about history being used in policy making as a way of understanding the present. And I think the current situation in Ukraine, in Russia, is a very pertinent example. And you know, President Putin makes something of a specialty of using and misusing historical evidence to make particular arguments. But I hope it will be of interest to people taking part in this discussion today that this is also very much what we're doing. No, not misusing, but using history. I hope in much more rigorous way to inform decisions being taken by politicians, to inform the communication effort of the British government to rebut certain claims being made. You know, for example, some of President Putin's claims about the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people, for example, and there are quite a number of examples. So just to move on to a few observations. Based on my experience as a civil servant and a diplomat working in Whitehall, I think the practice of official history is more embedded in some departments than others. It may be an obvious point, but I think that it has wider implications. So I've seen much more evidence of this, for example, in the FCDO and the Ministry of Defence, through the roles of people like Patrick, than in some other departments, and I would include the Treasury in that second category. However, I've also seen over the last decade or so a really growing interest, I think, and a very healthy interest amongst officials and policymakers in a wide range of departments in the contribution of official histories as a way of understanding where our institutions have come from and how particular trains of thought have evolved and developed, as well as the role of history in policy making. And I think that the example that the former permanent secretary at the Treasury, Nick Macpherson, set is very relevant to that. So he's not an academic historian, but was and is, he's now in the House of Lords, hugely interested in economic history, and has given, for example, just in 2016, a lecture to the British Academy on Keynes and Treasury policy making, tracing the history of Treasury caution or even scepticism about activist fiscal policy. And that's really, I think, a very good example of how understanding how particular types or chains of thought have developed is so important to understanding how we go about making policy today. Another observation, though, which I would be interested to hear other views on, is that my personal experience is that in all of the departments I've worked in across Whitehall, historians are less likely to be part of a policy-making team than, for example, economists or lawyers.
Just say while we're waiting for Rachel to come back on, and there's some wonderful quotes in Patrick's book, and he produced a couple of them, but I think my favorite, and Butterfield was talking about, you know, again, learning from history, and the learning from history in terms of the sort of the interwar period. He says, what you have to avoid in 1919 are not the mistakes of 1815, but the mistakes of 1919. And a version of that should probably go up across all our desks. What you have to avoid are the mistakes of 2022.
I shall attempt to carry on. I think most of the annoying sirens have now finished. Apologies if there's still a little bit of background noise. Yeah. So just to pick up on the point I was making, personal observation about the greater prevalence perhaps of economists and lawyers in policy-making teams rather than historians. And I just put out there an open question about whether that should change. I think there was a very interesting report from the Institute for Government in 2015 about the value of history in policy-making, which had a lot to say about that question. And then my final thought is that I think that, again, this is a very personal perspective, but there is a huge contribution that history, whether it's an official history or, as I say, a broader use of history in policy making, can make, which is both as a methodology and introducing perhaps different ways of thinking and challenging received wisdom in that way, as well as the content of that historical research on a particular place or period that I think has a very valuable role in my world. And I just wanted to finish actually picking up on some of the things that Helen was saying. But Helen, your work specifically about the history of the role of women in diplomatic life made me think that a big part of our job as civil servants, as diplomats, is not only to focus on the challenges of the moment, but also to look at the challenges of the future. And I think that some of the insights from your work could actually be of extreme value in stimulating thought about the changing nature of the diplomatic service, for example, the changing structure of families, socially and economically, and what does that mean for diplomacy going forward? So I shall leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. Simon, over to you next.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for everybody else. Nice to see you. The last time I had this kind of discussion, I was in fact sitting in the Foreign Office. It's nice to actually be with real people. It's nice that we're getting back to that, though we're online. And Patrick was there, and we were running a little event called The Practice of International History in the 21st Century, which was an AHLC-funded project about that very thing. And it was a group of official historians and also academic historians and other disciplines. And what struck me was the very noticeable reflex in British academe, at least as evinced by that project, was to help the state. There seemed to be, somewhat to my surprise, a very strong desire from the people who are in the room to help the British state. I say surprise because I don't actually see it as the role of academic historians, professional historians, to help the state. That is absolutely not our role. Our role is, or the state's role is to help the state. Academic historians' role is to write good history. And those two things do not necessarily match up. The two things that my colleagues were most enthusiastic on helping the state on was to explain why Brexit was a really very bad idea. And the second thing was to help the state to push back the propaganda of Vladimir Putin. So in some ways, that was 5 years ago. It seems that we are still in a bit of a time loop. I should say that my skepticism does not necessarily stretch to people working for the state, doing history, whether they're guns for hire or whether they are civil servants. That's very different, because then the state is employing those people and they are spokespeople of the state. They are not purporting to be independent historians, and that's absolutely fine. However, none of this is said. My second point is really to try and bury official history. There's an element of praise here. So the two sets of official histories that I personally have studied in some detail was, as Philip said, the emergence of internal histories, mainly about the intelligence services. And my argument was that they might be rubbish as history, and many of them are rubbish as history, but they were highly influential in describing and forming the field of intelligence as a separate and important entity within the British state. By writing its own history, it managed to find a niche for itself, particularly after the Second World War. But the other line of official history was the military history series, because I wrote a cultural history of the Battle of El Alamein. So the official history of El Alamein started on the 6th of November 1942. The battle had ended on the 4th of November 1942. So, you know, kind of the wheels started turning very quickly indeed. And the official history of Alamein is truly atrocious, written by non-historians, ex-military officers, and the classic secret drawer, not being able to refer to ultra. So essentially, the entire post-war British history project is worth very little as history. I'm not really talking about civil series, which I know less about, but you're definitely not going to learn what you need to know about the Second World War from reading that series. What you're going to learn about is how the British state wanted to control the memory of the Second World War, which is an interesting topic all of itself. However, I don't want people to stop writing this kind of stuff, however bad it is, because there's nothing like official history, authorized history, internal history, any of these types, to reveal the neuroses of the British state and those who dwell within. And they reveal themselves, in my view, much more in the relative backwater of writing official history than they do in the red hot heat of policy making itself, because it's more reflective and in some ways more detached from reality. And the people writing it can be lobbied and can be shaped, and that very process. So really what I would say to any official historians is please write your official history and keep all the paperwork, because we're not really interested in the end result. We are, however, very interested in the process. My third element of praise for official history, now I'm very much thinking of the team in the FCDO and the editing of documents rather than the narrative histories, is God, it saves everybody a lot of work. We forget sometimes just how rubbish it is going into a virgin archive. Who are these people? Who are these organizations? What the hell is happening here? You know, if, however, you've been provided with a roadmap and you know the people involved and the names all make sense and the structures in which they're working make sense, then that's incredibly useful. So more strength to the elbow of government sponsored and government employed historians for that, and I think we should all thank them for that incredibly meticulous work, which is incredibly time consuming and perhaps doesn't get as much glory as it should within the historical profession these days. And my final thought on visual history from 2022 is it's important for the state. It's important because it's a hedge against the day that universities don't care about the history of the state, or the history of policy making, and particularly the kind of policy making that we're interested in. We're mainly talking about diplomacy, economic, financial, fiscal policy, and war making. That the academy itself changes over the years, and it is quite. I can see a day in which those topics are not properly covered in the academy. The academy is very different from what it was in Butterfield's day. It was very different from what it was in Patrick's day, in Adam Tickell's word, who's head of Birmingham University. The academy is essentially a performative neoliberal organization which is mainly devoted to A, performing its own virtue, and B, making a great deal of money. And it will go wherever that's possible. And so we can't always trust those academic scholars who have much less academic freedom than they did in Butterfield's day to do a good job. So the state has to take responsibility itself, and I think that's a jolly good thing. So on that, I will leave it.
Thank you very much, Simon. You've given us a lot to think about there. And finally, over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much. I mean, I feel slightly like I need to defend official historians after that last. You know, not just the method, the books are normally quite good as well, I think, as well. So they're certainly worth a read. Very nice to be here. Thanks. Very nice to see Ian Beasley, one of my former official historian colleagues. We shared an office for many years, and he's on the call as well. So it'd be great to hear from him at some point. What I wanted to do is just spend a few minutes talking about the history I wrote. Volume 1 came out in 2014. Volume 2 is 96% finished, but has been stuck at 96% for 2 years because of COVID and because of the admin hell that is being a head of department. But I'll come back to that. And I was commissioned to write the Joint Intelligence Committee history back in 2007, and I think it was really based on two things. One was that MI5 and SIS had authorised their histories, or they were in the process of being written, and the Joint Intelligence Committee very much felt it wanted to get in on the act. The JIC, I think, is different because lots of its records have been released, but actually, as I discovered going into it, there are lots and lots of gaps, and there are whole portions of what the committee did that haven't been released. I think the other element to its commissioning was in 2007, of course. This was the aftermath of Iraq. This was the aftermath of the Butler report, what had gone wrong. And so part of this was part of a bigger trend, certainly within intelligence analysis, this idea of professionalizing. And actually, if you could learn from what had gone on in the past, if you could look at other disciplines, then that could only be a good thing. And I was not a newcomer to the JIC. My PhD cum books, Spying on the Nuclear Bear, all about British intelligence on the Soviet nuclear weapons program. I still think a good book, very badly written, but I think the analysis is quite good, so probably worth a read if you're very bored. But I think it had introduced me to the JIC, and I had seen some elements of it, but again, not the whole picture. And when I began the project, I sort of had 3 quotes in mind I discovered fairly early on. One of them was a quote from Trevor Roper, a historian who had wartime intelligence work, was kind of stung by the Hitler diaries, I think. But he said, when a historian relies mainly on primary sources which we cannot easily check, he challenges our confidence and forces us to ask critical questions. How reliable is his historical method? How sound is his judgment? Which are important questions for an official historian, of course. You know, depending on the official history, there are either greater or lesser amounts of material already open. Although I think that is actually a sort of accusation which you can level at anyone working on intelligence history particularly. But I was also had 2 other quotes, both from former members of the JIC. One of them was, I think all of my colleagues would agree that it will be in the future quite impossible for anybody to unravel with any accuracy from the archives the detailed history of events. And another one who said, if we could spare the time or staff, we should probably derive great benefit from examining in retrospect the accuracy of information on which policy was based, and the correctness of the conclusions drawn from it. And I still remember going into the then Cabinet Office retained archive in the bottom of Admiralty Arch, a little bit like that opening scene in Ghostbusters, where it's all very dusty and, you know, without the ghost, but with the shelves where you can turn the wheel and the shelves move back and forth, and seeing these great filthy boxes that probably hadn't been looked at for years. And, you know, if you can imagine the historical equivalent of a kid in a sweet shop, it was absolutely that moment. And there were some great early discoveries. One of my favourite ones, I think, which will be in volume 2, was a single document, actually 2 single documents, about the JIC ghost, about a security guard who was there one evening in the 60s, who wrote very solemnly, very seriously to his boss saying, I went out to the loo, it was the middle of the night, I came back and my keys were floating on the desk. And this person was saying, well, you know, if he says they were floating on the desk, they were probably floating on his desk. And it poses a problem which I suppose all historians have encountered, but is, I think, even more acute with official history, where you see those little gems and you think, wow, what happened? You know, was he sent off to recuperate? What was there a ghost? What happened? And you don't find the answers. And writing the official history, you know, having access to all of the documents is fascinating, and it causes great problems in the same way that it causes great bonuses, I suppose. You know, one is the volume of information. All of a sudden, you're confronted with huge amounts of documents, and it's quite hard to know what to pick and what to exclude. And of course, people then reading the book say, well, why did you look at this and why did you exclude that? And for me, volume 2 will be even more like that, because I've just had to exclude more things than I can include. There's also problems with documents, even when you have access to everything, of course. It doesn't mean everything is there. I recall seeing one document from the 70s, which was sort of lamenting the past, saying, you know, up until 1957, whatever it might have been, we had 5,000 files, and then there was a big destruction, and, you know, there's only 700 of them remain. So actually, even when you have access, it doesn't mean you know everything that went on, because there's just so much that isn't written down or anything else. But it does allow you to do great things that you can't necessarily do otherwise. One of the first things I did was to have the then JIC chairman write a sort of letter of introduction that I could use to go to people to interview them, which spoke about the project, spoke about clearances and all the rest. And one of my, I think, favourite early, and probably one of the most important early interviews, was interviewing a 90-year-old former RAF officer who in the early 1950s had been the Assistant Secretary of the Joint Intelligence Committee. And I would always ask people, you know, something about the work they had done, something about the colour and atmosphere, and just to try and recreate what it was like working at that time, because that sort of thing is never recorded in the documents. And all of the interviews I did record, by the way, for posterity. And I remember saying to him, the last question was always, you know, do you have any funny anecdotes or stories? And he said being Assistant Secretary was the most important lesson in his life, because after the first meeting, he'd been given the job of writing the minutes of the JIC meeting. And if anyone has ever read historical minutes of JIC meetings, they're not exactly page turners. And he'd written the minutes and he'd shown them to the then chairman, who was a sort of senior Foreign Office diplomat. And the chairman exploded and said, you can't have people saying that. You can't have very clever people saying such idiotic things. And for him, the great lesson was not to record what they said, but record what he thought they were planning to say. And it was a great lesson in the power of interviews, I suppose, but also the power of relying too extensively on documents, even when you've got them all there. There are other problems, I think, and I'll just speak for another minute or so and then pass back. I mean, I think there are problems if you're writing something which you know from the historical record, but you're then writing in an official capacity. It makes it very difficult sometimes, and there are issues where you can and can't say things. Volume 1, for instance, took 2 years to clear for various reasons. One of the issues was, who are the US representatives that come to JIC meetings? And because this was an official account, if you read volume 1, all you will find them is US representatives. If you go to other books, you will find out which agency they may or may not have worked for. And so there are various sort of difficulties like that, I think. Volume 2, as I say, is sort of 96% finished. It goes from 1957, hopefully up to 2003. has not yet started the clearance process, so who knows quite how long it will take or when it will appear. And then I just want to finish with a couple of last thoughts, really. One is, I think that being an official historian, you know, is an absolute privilege and all the rest of it, but I think it's hugely important for government. Some departments like the FCDO do have in-house historians, and as Patrick began by saying, you know, it's still employed for not just historical work, but for contemporary events that are going on. Not all departments, of course, have official historians, and I've been used throughout my period since 2007 as the sort of corporate memory of the JIC. You know, have we ever tried this in the past? You know, because someone's got this great idea that we should try something new now, and did it work or did it not work? And partly I think that reflects a sort of broader point about government and the way that government today, you know, people tend to be generalists rather than specialists, and corporate memory doesn't really exist in the way that perhaps it once did in the past. And I suppose that leads me on to my final point, which is really a plea, which is, you know, if anyone is listening, to try and get the official history program back up and running in a concerted fashion. And certainly in the area that I work on, intelligence and security, up until about 10 years ago, there was a fantastic records group that met between some of the reviewers within the Cabinet Office, some of the government historians and academics working on this. And it met maybe once a year or twice a year, fairly informal, but it was an opportunity for people to come together and talk about which records they were interested in, how the declassification process was perhaps changing, and just have an informal dialogue. And that died to death perhaps 10 years ago, and I think it would be a great thing to resurrect again. So I shall stop there and hand back, Philip.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to all our speakers. It's given us a huge amount to discuss. I would remind members of the audience to write down questions that you have on chat, and 10 or 15 minutes we'll feed those into the discussion. I just want to tease out one or two points just amongst the panelists first, and it's sort of going back to something Rachel mentioned about using history to rebut some of the historical claims made by Putin. And it strikes me there's a very long history of that, almost, you know, in the publication of documents on the origins of the First World War, largely arises, as I understand it, because the Bolsheviks started to publish the sort of Tsarist archives on the war as a kind of form of public diplomacy, as a propaganda effort. And the Germans followed and the British followed. So immediately there you see a kind of a distinction, which I'd like to talk about a little bit, about what we might call the public official histories, the private official histories. When you publish an official history, it immediately becomes part of a kind of an information effort, whether you like it or not. An internal history, purely for internal use, some of the things that Simon was looking at in his book on intelligence, is perhaps a different thing. But is it so different? Are internal histories making their own attempt to make an argument, say, to the Treasury or to the rest of Whitehall? I mean, Patrick, I suppose you've been involved in both in a sense, writing for internal use and external use. Do you see a distinction there?
Yeah, there is a distinction. I mean, there is a genre of internal histories written within the Foreign Office, actually, most of which have never been published, which are not so much trying to persuade anybody, but trying to get the record down before it's all forgotten. And somebody involved in a major negotiation will write, if you're lucky, you'll give them 3 months or so to write it. We published one last year, actually. It was written by Robin Rennick, now Lord Rennick, on the Lancaster House conference. And he was deeply involved in that, and they sensibly gave him a few months to write it all up. And he wrote a very interesting paper, which is very narrowly focused, because that's what it's meant to be. It's looking at the lessons for the Foreign Office itself. And most of them are in that category. Beyond that, I'm going to jump around a bit, because I think that, you know, Simon made some of the most relevant comments on this. Official histories can be extremely flawed, and the wartime official histories are a good example of that. And what Michael was talking about also is I'm jumping a bit too far perhaps, but the problem of clearance. We all have that problem, some more than others. And this was a problem right from the start. Actually, if you look at some of the major wartime official histories, the classic one was the strategic bombing offensive by Franklin and Webster. They tried to suppress that for many, many years. You eventually needed the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, to open it up. So there are internal histories which are very functional and inward-looking. There are external histories which, as Simon says, are sort of giving the government line, as it were. And there is an inevitable compromise in the latter. In the internal history, you can be fairly frank because nobody's going to read it ever, perhaps, or not for many, many years.
I mean, that's one of the interesting things I sort of noticed in Simon's book was that this internal history of MI5 by Curry, which was finally published in the 90s. Simon suggests that probably Percy Sillitoe, who was around when it was produced, never actually even looked at it. Is this a problem? I mean, just from a consumer's point of view, Rachel, I mean, how do policymakers consume history, either sort of internal history or published histories? Where is it most useful?
I think, as probably you would expect the answer to be to that, it varies enormously. And I think this does come back a bit to some of the points I was making there about what I view as the importance of creating a culture in which historical evidence and historical methodology is seen as important and relevant and having something important to contribute. I think there's then actually a sort of a job of education. And one part of my experience of working on different projects and initiatives across Whitehall is in some cases often just a fundamental lack of experience and knowledge about the process of producing history, of doing historical research, and in some examples for maybe policymakers expecting there to be a single unanimous answer, and of course that's often not what academia in any branch, history or otherwise, produces. And so there is something of an education effort to support and help policymakers to get the most out of the historical research and discussion.
I mean, Helen, did you feel, I mean, you in your interactions with Foreign Office staff, did you feel in a way you could bring extra things to bear as an unofficial historian that maybe that you could do as if you'd been an official historian within the Foreign Office?
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I mean, as I said, obviously, kind of my background is a kind of broadly, academic historian, trained in modern British history, with sort of very kind of broad interests in women's and gender history as well. And I guess, the way that I wrote my book and approached the research kind of reflected that kind of broader interest and training. I mean, I think it's very different from perhaps the kinds of official histories that Michael and Simon and Patrick indeed are kind of talking about, because in a way it's my topic was a kind of topic about, it was a sort of social and cultural history really of a particular institution and a particular profession. And I guess it didn't have very kind of clear kind of lessons perhaps that could be sort of bullet pointed in the way that perhaps some other policy topics might, or kind of no kind of smoking guns or kind of revelatory discoveries. In a sense, what I was sort of interested in doing, like what I wanted to kind of talk to people about the FCO, was just about actually, there is this history that you don't understand, that hasn't really been written before about a particular group within the workforce, who in fact have not actually been sort of recognised as equals within the diplomatic profession for all that long, and actually, you know, for a very, very long time. You know, we're talking about an institution and a profession that was founded on a set of assumptions about sexual difference and about diplomacy as requiring attributes that are possessed by men, and that actually leaves a legacy. You know, and it's a kind of career structure that has been, you know, since the early 19th century, founded around a set of assumptions about the heteronormative family. So, you know, all of these very broad insights that come from just sort of thinking historically about the institution and its culture. So, you know, so I think I was, yeah, maybe I was kind of able to bring that breadth to the topic and hopefully offer some insight. But as I say, you know, it doesn't have the kind of, you know, here are the kind of key takeaways. Here's, you know, what you should do differently next time. It's not quite the same, doesn't lend itself to quite the same kinds of insights, perhaps, as other topics.
Thanks. I mean, Mike, I mean, asking a similar question, have you found that your interactions with policymakers have been different as an official historian to, you know, a very respected historian coming in from the outside?
I mean, I think the answer is yes and no. I think, you know, one of the things that makes it easier to talk to policymakers and people in the civil service are clearances. And, you know, if you're an official historian, the clearances come with it. So I think it's, in some ways, it's hard to distinguish between the two. On the other hand, if I look at my main interactions with bits of the Cabinet Office, I think it's very much from knowing the history and understanding the history and where the system has come from, as much as it is being a sort of window into academia. Going back to one of the earlier questions about internal histories versus official histories, I mean, I've also written an internal history unrelated to this, and it was designed to be classified, never released, and it was a very different writing process, and it was a very different process for interacting with the department it was written in. I think the advantage of, I mean, if I were to take a step back, I would say the advantage of both of those is actually having an academic working in government, having someone who understands both worlds, and particularly working around the area of, I suppose, assessment and analysis, and trying to get the old-fashioned, you know, academics are often criticised for living in ivory towers, and it's a valid criticism, but I think government is often criticised for not engaging enough with those on the outside. And one of the great advantages I found, I think, is being someone who with a foot in both worlds and being able to interact between the two. And that is partly from being an official historian, and I think it's also partly from having the clearances, which mean you can speak to people and talk about things in a way which perhaps you couldn't from the outside.
And so, Simon, you've looked at these really internal histories with respect to the intelligence community. So this bigger issue, are there lessons to be learned from history if it's done in an honest way, particularly in the field of intelligence history? Were any of these, you know, you talked about keeping the papers, but were these exercises useful in any way for in terms of learning?
They were useful in terms of learning, but it doesn't mean they were good history, because essentially what is evolved from the internal process, and remember, I'm talking about a process of the 40s and 50s. You know, I have no insight into the current process. It is a series of talking points and, I don't know, shibboleths of things that we believe to be true, and they're not really going to be questioned thereafter. And so what survives and what is important that it survives is those, and the actual histories are then chucked in a drawer and never read again. So sort of, I'm not arguing that the histories have much direct effect. What they do is they enable people and organizations to create a kind of a set of norms, a set of assumptions, not Jane Joel's unspoken assumptions. They're spoken assumptions, but they're not challenged or challengeable assumptions, unless there's a crisis, in which case people go back and they might indeed challenge them, and you start again. But there's remarkable tenacity for some of these ideas. I mean, the obvious tenacity that is that SIS is somehow important or competent. And sort of that organization managed to hold, sort of essentially hold the center, and still does, as far as I know, is truly remarkable. But it's got a good story to tell, and it tells it.
I think it's interesting that you touched upon something that Alex Green talks about in her book on history, policy and public purpose, which is history as a process rather than as content as such, as what we would regard as historical outputs. It's sort of, it is in a sense bringing historical expertise to bear on day-to-day issues as they occur, because history is so much part of the kind of the rhetoric of policy making. Simon, you're muted still. Yeah.
The important history becomes embedded. It doesn't exist in documents which bill themselves as histories, even in internal histories, although it may have started out there. It starts off, it exists in the first few pages of virtually any policy-making document that you look at. That there's, how did we get to the current position? What are the important analogues? What are the state's standard operating procedures when faced with this? So there are quite often histories written into documents, definitely foreign policy documents. So it's all there. So the history is exerting its effect, but that's quite a long way downstream from any professional historian. Indeed a professional historian was ever involved in creating these. I mean, you took the example of Jack Curry, who is a career MI5 officer, with no real qualifications as a historian, apart from the fact he's very old, and they don't want him a bit cranky, and they want to put him in a cupboard. And they do put him in a cupboard to write this history. It doesn't mean it's not useful, and it's actually useful not because he's a historian, because he's an insider with some axes to grind.
And I suppose it's on the question of whether historians can be sort of non-combatants in history. In policy making. I mean, not just Putin in the current crisis, but one listened to Joe Biden's speech yesterday, and one could really go to any politician's speech at any point. But Biden, is constantly evoking history. History has shown time and time again, he says, when the history of this episode comes to be written, Biden says, it's just so much part of rhetoric, political rhetoric and policy making, and how we go about thinking about issues. But Jacob, would you like to feed some of the questions that have come in?
Certainly. Thank you, Philip, and thank you to our speakers for the discussion so far. We've had a question from Dr. Martin Brown in the context of the historical analogies being used in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He wonders whether our panel could comment on some of the appropriate analogies to use, and whether there are distortions in national narratives more broadly, and the memory wars since the 90s.
Who would like to start with that? Patrick, do you want to have a go? You're muted still, yeah.
I think I was just trying to avoid answering that one, actually. Yeah, I don't think. I mean, analogies are problematic, aren't they? And that history doesn't repeat itself. And if you use the shorthand like Munich or something, it may have some meaning, but it's not going to get you very far, and it'll probably be more damaging than helpful. I don't feel qualified to answer this question, actually. I just think it's one that we should be thinking about, but it's probably almost too big to discuss in this context. I'm sorry to cop out.
Maybe while people start to sort of get to grips with that question, maybe Jacob, you could feed in one or two others, and then we could see who wants to think.
Certainly. So we've had some questions about whether the opportunities in terms of privileged access to materials outweigh the limitations faced by writers of official histories.
Mike, do you want to have a go at that? Yeah.
I mean, the simple answer is yes. I think having access. I did think about this a lot before taking on the project, and had conversations that if you write this, there will be limitations on what you can and can't write, and the way in which stuff has to be assessed in the future. But I thought, actually, the sort of selfish joys of seeing what's in there outweigh anything else. And I have to say, 15 years on from starting that, I wouldn't change my mind at all. There are some problems, I suppose, in writing things which aren't actually that serious. There are some problems in terms of clearing the first volume, which ultimately weren't that serious. But the advantages definitely outweigh it, both for the history and, as I said earlier, for being sort of academic embedded in government as well.
Okay, so Simon.
Well, the simple answer is no, because it might be advantageous to the official historians, but it's disadvantageous to every other historian, that there is this information control going on. And so sort of the kind of definitely individuals, it's advantageous, but for the grand sweep of the historical profession in Britain, it's not advantageous, I wouldn't say.
Mike, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I disagree. Sorry, I disagree 100% with that view. I mean, I think it's, if you look at official history books, the point of them is they are the first telling of history. They are giving someone access to documents where the subject matter is probably still very sensitive, and they're allowing invariably an academic historian who should have their own credentials to stand on their own 2 feet as a historian who should be trusted, that opportunity. In an ideal world, of course, all documents would be released so that people could do all of this themselves, but that's totally impractical and unrealistic. So I don't think there are very many official historians that you could point to, official histories rather, you could point to and say that has done nothing to help the historic profession, that has done nothing to help us understand. I mean, there are some very poor ones, I don't deny that. But actually, it helps the historical profession, I think, hugely by showing the first telling of what's available. I think it helps the historical profession by helping preserve documents. Ian's question in the chat comes to that a little bit. I think it helps also with some of the clearances of documents and the release of them to the archives, because you have academics who are cleared, who can see stuff that hasn't been released, who can then say, actually, this stuff already exists in this file or this archive, so there's no reason not to hold it back. So I completely disagree with you.
Okay, I just want to pull out another couple of sort of opposite things that have been presented as opposites here. And that you've touched on, really. Well, the first is the sort of the access implicitly for the official historian against partial lack of access for the ordinary foot soldier. And it strikes me that this idea of the secret drawer is a very powerful one. It's powerful for historians. It's also particularly powerful for journalists, I think. This idea of the secret document that no one really knows about, and in a sense, this whole area has slightly been skewed by the ultra secret, which was a big secret and pretty well kept. and perhaps by Venona, which is sort of finally released in the 90s, which was a bit of a game changer. But it strikes me that there aren't, it's always difficult to know if the light really does go off when you close the fridge door, but there don't seem to be other, big secrets that official histories have been able to reveal. I mean, thinking about the Chris Andrews' authorized history of MI5. What Andrew is really doing is kind of validating some rumors about MI5 and trying to invalidate others or not mentioning them. But there were no huge revelations in that. So is the secret drawer ultimately a little bit of a myth? And the other sort of binary opposite is I suppose between freedom for the ordinary historian, for the academic historian, and constraints for the authorized historian. And again, I sort of wonder about that, as particularly for contemporary historians, when we're dealing with people who are still alive, or who have family, we make all sorts of compromises. We have to. Life is a process of negotiation. We're maybe not as free as we think we are. Helen, what do you think about that in terms of, because you've done a lot of that kind of contemporary research and oral history research.
Yeah, I think that's right, in that we shouldn't kind of overstate these or kind of set up kind of false binaries. I mean, I think, also, in some ways the point about not being able to check sources, or maybe, citing documents that readers or even fellow academics won't be able to, check the sources if they wanted to. Well, most of the time you don't, people don't go off to check your sources. Sometimes they do, but and certainly also if you're doing oral history, and for various reasons you're not able to deposit your transcripts, or your participants don't want the transcripts or the tapes deposited, then again, actually there you're really saying to your reader, you just have to take it on trust that this is what they said. So actually that's in a sense not something that's so peculiar to official history, and you're right, with on kind of the sort of freedom and constraint. But if I may, I just actually wanted to go back to the very first question about sort of invoking history at the level of political rhetoric, because it did make me think about when do historians sort of feed into political speech writing? Do we actually have a sense of that, about where historical expertise actually becomes part of quite like political decisions about how policy issues are going to be kind of framed? And I also thought that it was sort of interesting what Simon was saying about actually kind of historical assumptions are kind of present everywhere in the archive, like all kinds of documents contain particular kind of understandings of change and continuity, and how the present relates to the past, and actually that's something which we really ought to be trying to kind of get a handle on, not just about historians providing expertise or advice, but also, if you like, the kind of sort of broader mental maps that policymakers bring to the process. And I was thinking, as a really kind of sort of thought-provoking book by Priya Satya called Time's Monster, which is all about the kind of the sort of the vision of historical progress that was so ingrained in people who were sort of participants, people who were involved in running the British Empire. They were so kind of this idea that history will judge us kindly because what we're doing is a kind of civilizing, progressive project. And she shows how that's actually really ingrained in a very kind of fundamental way within the imperial project. I think that's a kind of another way of thinking about history in policymaking, that kind of broader, just historical sensibility, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Rachel, would you like to say something about that from your own experience? How these sort of historical assumptions become embedded in policy making?
I think Helen raised some quite sort of thought-provoking points around who is involved in this process, who is doing the influencing, feeding in, etc. And I think that at a political level, that is often it can be quite personal, depending on the connections that an individual politician has, their own sort of personal. The background in which their thought and political ideology has been formed is, of course, going to be hugely influential in terms of whom they then turn to for advice to feed into their own thinking, whether that's writing a speech or working on a particular policy. And I think we would know one could observe quite a number of examples of that in the current government. So when it comes to an official level, it's where I personally think that there is a very important place for some sort of basic almost awareness training or raising amongst public officials in the potential contribution of historical research and historical method, and in how to go about that, how to go, whom to approach, and how to think about those questions in order to then provide suitably informed advice to politicians who are going to come, as I say, inevitably with all of their own baggage.
Thank you very much. Patrick, you were waiting to come in.
Thanks. I mean, there are so many different things coming up, and I'm very conscious looking at the chat that some really important points being raised, and I could try to answer nearly all of them if I could.
Is there anything you'd like to pull up, Patrick?
I want to talk about the secret. I want to talk about the secret drawer, because people wonder whether things are being held back. See, they are. I mean, obviously, government tries to conceal stuff, and the example that somebody cited here is the Hanslope disclosure of the Mau Mau related stuff, the so-called migrated archive, and that the history of that is so complicated and yet so banal that it does explain quite a lot about government. You know, the British government didn't want former colonial governments to see this stuff. On the other hand, they didn't destroy it, which they could have done. And it was held back for many, many years, not so much deliberately as because people forgot it was there, if you see what I mean. So, but there is a broader secret drawer, and it's the one actually that Ian Beasley raised. And it's also one that Helen was, in a sense, talking about when she said, if I'd been an official historian, I might have been able to see more stuff. And Ian's saying there's a lot of stuff and it's not properly understood. And the answer is, Helen, you're right, because James Southern, our student, and Sarah, our other student, they did see very boring HR records, which the National Archive would have deemed to be dispensable. And that, of course, explained what policy was on things like homosexuality in the Foreign Office. You know, so I think I'm actually beginning to not blame government, but blaming the National Archive for very, very narrow criteria for stuff to be sent to the archive. We follow their rules. They have a very limited understanding of what's important historically for the history of various institutions. Somebody also mentioned the history of the Troubles, and this raises the question of the future of official history, which Michael and I have interests in. I think it's run into the sand, and so do the people in the Cabinet Office, and they would like to get it going again. But in fact, the Northern Ireland Office is trying to launch a new history of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. It was announced in the Belfast Telegraph. It's barely been announced in the rest of the United Kingdom. But I'm reasonably confident this is going to be as good as it can be of such a venture. We've spoken to a couple of officials who certainly have the right idea about openness and inclusiveness and things like that. So I think that, and they're also following the maxims of Sir Joe Pilling's report, which the government didn't actually suppress but never took any notice of. So I have hopes that might be a way of getting things going again. I'll stop there because I could say a lot more, but I better not.
Thank you very much. Mike, you were waiting to come back in.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, it's also about the secret drawer and about what Ian has said. I mean, as Ian knows, he and I discovered a file that had been marked for destruction, which was all about Margaret Thatcher's visit to a meeting of the JIC, which was symbolic, and it was, as far as we both were aware, the first time a Prime Minister had actually gone to a JIC meeting whose function is deliberately to not have ministers there. And we wrote it up and it appeared on the Number 10 website. But I think, you know, we would often go and see the files marked for destruction and try and work out what should be saved and what shouldn't be saved. And we were doing it from our own perspective. And who knows if a historian in 5 years would have a totally different view to all of that. So I agree with him. I agree with Patrick very much about the nature of records. You know, if shelf space wasn't expensive and an issue, then everything would probably be kept, and that would be a great thing, of course. Just on the very quick point of, you know, the issue of enigma and is there a sort of secret of that level lurking elsewhere? I found with both volumes of mine, the story is generally well understood. It's the sort of small details which perhaps haven't been released, but it doesn't necessarily change the whole story. But I think that's a very important thing to study still. But I'll stop there.
And it seemed to me that Hounslow Park was a kind of secret drawer that wasn't so secret. I mean, it was a scandal that the material was held back, but there's been a sort of a tendency to exaggerate what it actually tells us, as though we didn't know about abuses under the Mau Mau counterinsurgency campaign, whereas in fact there was a huge amount of material which Caroline Elkins had very thoroughly mined for her book in the CO records which were released in the 1980s. Jacob, do you want to feed in one final question, which is coming up to two?
Certainly. So two of them sort of relate to the issue of departmental change and institutional restructuring and how that affects memory loss, institutional memory loss, and whether these smaller temporary departments or projects get less coverage in the record.
Helen, you were nodding very vigorously there, so you want to come in?
Not really. I'm just nodding, saying yes, yes. Please, I'm worried about it.
Patrick, what's about?
I'm actually reading the last comment. B. Coffin. Should governments be working more systematic? So historians be working more systematically, the government department, about record keeping. I think record keeping is the key.
Yeah.
Now there isn't any record keeping, if I can put it bluntly. We're lucky in a sense that everything now gets saved because there's a huge dump where everything digital arrives at. But there's no way of organizing or searching it. It can be saved, thank goodness, and is being transferred to the National Archives. But the old sense in which if you wanted to look up, if somebody came to a new topic and they wanted to find out about it, they'd open up the file and some registry clerk would have brought it to them and it would all be nicely organized, is meaningless now. There is no such concept of files in that sense. So we're all working in the dark and all repeating. I'm maybe being too critical. Rachel may know better than I do, but government seems to be totally repeating itself the whole time because it has no institutional memory.
I think this is the great worry, and it's a great worry with digitization of records, that those beautifully crafted minute sheets in which officials would think aloud from the 1950s and 1960s just aren't going to be there for future generations of historians. It's a rather sad note in which to end. What's been a fantastic discussion. So thank you all, Patrick, Helen, Mike, Simon, Rachel. I'm sure that everyone's really enjoyed this. I certainly have. And thank you all to our audience who've asked some really interesting questions yourselves. So thank you very much, and keep in touch with History and Policy, please. Thanks.